Hello and welcome to the Conservative Progress Digital Media Review with me, Luke Springthorpe and Alan O'Kelly. Yes, the gang are back together, no guests this week, which will be a tremendous relief to those of you that have missed Luke's face and or Alan's face. We've got three pieces today. One from The Spectator, which is Gerard Lyon's call for us not to panic about the UK's high debt. Second piece is an article by Douglas Murray, so much for the bravery of the Harper's letter for Unheard. And the third article is by Chris Skidmore, who of course was Universities Minister twice for Conservative Home. Why it's time to ditch the 50% target for universities. So coming to you first, Alan, why does Gerard Lyon say we shouldn't panic about the UK's high and mounting debt?
Yeah, it's a really good article actually, and it's really interesting as to how he's approaching it. I think what we've seen in the government and what we've seen from government now is a huge and massive increase in the debt to GDP ratio. It's now gone above 100% of debt to GDP. So our debt is now greater than our entire economic activity. The economy has shrank massively. Is a really interesting point in there that the shrinkage is equal to what was 18 years worth of growth. So we've seen a huge step back in both economic growth and in the size of the economy, and also in the increase in the level of debt. But I think what his point is that there are a number of ways of tackling debt, and that we aren't in a panic situation or crisis situation just yet. There's a couple of things that work for us. One is inflation rates are still low, and interest rates are still low, which means servicing the debt is actually a relatively straightforward approach, although there's a huge debt service target to hit. The other part is that there is some evidence so far, and it's hard to know how deep this evidence is, of an economic rebound, that we are seeing some kind of consumers starting to spend again, businesses starting to spend again. And while it's not entirely explicit in this piece, there is a point here that, unlike, let's say, the 2008 financial recession, which was a recession, which was a massive stop of economic activity, what we are also seeing here is a lot of pent-up demand. Lots of people in the last 3 months would have, while continuing to receive their salary or a payment of some kind, we're not consuming. And if we can get consumers going again, we can grow the debt again, or grow the GDP again. And that's the key point here. There are actually two parts to it. It's a debt to GDP ratio. We can cut the debt level, or we can grow the GDP ratio level to get our debt to GDP ratio down. Or ideally, we'll probably end up doing a combination of both. I think in the end of the day, there's really tough choices ahead for the Chancellor. I think he's gotten huge praise, rightly, for the amount of work he's done in terms of guiding the economy to this point. I think the big challenge now is going to be, turning off the spigots in some parts of the economy, reorientating the economy to different places, and starting to kind of get us back on the track of growth. And this probably, while Gerard didn't make this point, I think it's important to kind of note that, we've seen in last week huge numbers of job losses, like John Lewis, Boots, and others. The wave is starting to hit us. The economic wave of COVID-19 is starting to hit. And it's going to be really important now for government to have a very clear economic message, starting this week and then moving on into the budget and into the rest of the second half of the year.
I couldn't agree with you more in terms of the messaging. The messaging is vital, but I want to see it followed through with policies. And one of the places in Gerard's article where rhetoric marries with policy, or at least with a nugget of a policy thrust, is right at the end, where he writes that a decade ago the focus was on cut, and he says austerity occupied centre stage, but it was wrong then, and it would be inappropriate now. Instead, he writes, the focus has rightly moved on to build, and jobs. And worth noting, of course, that he's at Policy Exchange and is a former chief economic advisor to the now Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Luke, where are you at?
I think it's a really interesting piece. I think the statement to the obvious as well, I guess, is that there are different types of debt. So there's obviously government debt, which I think this article largely focuses on. There is then consumer debt, which actually I think things like credit card debt has actually come down during this crisis, presumably people incurring less expenses. But actually, I think for me, one of the areas that the regulator, actually the Financial Conduct Authority, addressed a couple of weeks ago was concern over the rising levels of corporate debt. And I think that's actually something the government should be concerned about addressing, and perhaps why they shouldn't be so concerned about government debt at the moment, and should perhaps look towards something like a corporation tax cut or holiday of some sort to make sure that the businesses that have been forced to close and perhaps absorb, for some of them probably the worst year that they will ever have, and to help them back on their feet. So I actually think that there definitely is a very strong argument for the government not being focused too much. Obviously, they need to maintain international credibility, because the moment that the government starts losing credibility is not a good place. It could be a run on the pound or something. But I don't think under the current stewardship that is likely. I think the government can credibly borrow for a little longer, for maybe 1, 2 or 3 years, at slightly elevated levels, to make sure that the businesses that are going to get us out of this are allowed to get back on their feet and to actually start creating the jobs that we need again.
All makes perfect sense, man. I think you should be on the Chancellor's team. Look, Alan wants to come in again.
Just a minute. I think that's a really good point. I think that's a really important part of this, and it is mentioned in the article, is that we need to actually support businesses' growth, and we need to support businesses investing. We need to support businesses. We need a pro-business, pro-enterprise, low regulatory environment now, that gets out of the way of business, and that we need to look at every part of it, whether it's planning laws, whether it's licensing laws, whether it's what are the regulatory laws. There needs to be a real focus now on firing economic growth, because that is really the only way out of this.
Well, Boris has promised the greatest liberalisation of the planning law since the end of the Second World War. So I'm just waiting to see what that looks like and how that translates through to reality, and how it transpires in terms of action and getting those landowners, developers off those land banks. Right, we said we'd be quick today, guys, so we're going to bang straight on to the second article. What sparked this originally was the 150 writers who appended their names to a letter in Harper's Magazine, which seemed to me to be potentially inoffensive, but it's kicked up an enormous stink, as you can imagine, led by perhaps, at least notionally led by J.K. Rowling. These 150 folk from the centre right through to the centre left essentially said that free speech is important. I know this is something that we've banged on about before, but Douglas Murray asks, is it possible to re-establish the bare minimum rules of political disagreement in the internet age? Latest developments at the front line of the culture wars would suggest not. Alan, what's your take?
A couple of things. I think, yes, I think what we've seen has been an attempt, what we've moved beyond is into a world now where it's no longer permissible just to disagree. We now have to kind of end anyone who disagrees with us, and we have to go after their jobs, their livelihoods, and things like that. That's a remarkable move from where we used to be. Where we used to be was, if I didn't like something that someone said or something that someone did, I might not have purchased what they were selling. I might not have watched what they were talking about, but I would not have gone after it. And I think we are seeing a move beyond discourse into actually attempting to punish people for views that they hold or don't hold. I think on the other side, what that's also caused is a bit of a retrenchment on both sides, where it's kind of a sense now to say, well, my free right to free speech is absolute, and that I can say whatever I want, wherever I want, however I want, regardless of how insulting it might be to you. And I think both sides actually have to learn the art of political discourse again. That the right to say something does, and while you have a right, you don't have a right not to be offended. Equally, I think we shouldn't be setting out to offend people. We shouldn't be trying to offend people. We should be trying to understand both sides, and that's the bit that's missing. What we've seen is from a lot of groups is rather than trying to argue with each other. And when political scientists look at this, right, when people talk about how to convince people of arguments and how to convince voters on the doorstep, the single most effective thing is to talk about your experience, is to say, here's what my experience is, and here's how it's affected me, and here's how it's affected my friends and family. And we've lost that. And I think the arguments, one thing would and conservatives, our challenge is actually we have to engage. We've seen in the last weeks kind of like this migrant written off Twitter, for example, to Parliament because they're not happy with Twitter, rather than and I think this is really important. I think continuous engagement is really important. And I think this letter was well timed, and it was great to see from a different side of the fence.
Luke?
It's fascinating, isn't it? I always think there needs to be a debate about debate now, because I think obviously there does need to be ample space for people with differing viewpoints to freely air them. But by the same token, I don't think that should necessarily be extended to, carte blanche to say whatever on earth you like without any consequence. Because I think, that there are times when, frankly, people say some truly outrageous things that we shouldn't lose sight of it being unacceptable. And, obviously, part of the calculation that companies sometimes make is if someone ends up bringing their employer's reputation into question, then there obviously is pressure on that employer as well. But that said, I definitely feel that the lines of the range of what was considered acceptable opinions to freely air and debate is becoming ever narrower, and I certainly think places like Twitter can be quite vitriolic echo chambers at times, where I think, frankly, the moment the author of Harry Potter starts becoming this almost pantomime villain on Twitter, I find it bizarre to watch this whole thing unfold, to be honest now, and it really has gone too far. And I think there needs to be, we need to try and claim this debate away from people just shouting at each other to actually saying, right, what are the parameters of what people can say and should be respected regardless of your viewpoint, and then, frankly, maybe when is it a little bit too far, and when does it just become downright offence? But I think that's a grown-up debate that needs to happen, and probably not on Twitter.
Couldn't agree with you more. I mean, each and every time I have a conversation with a leftist friend about this, I say it's simple. You shouldn't be allowed to incite hatred, and you shouldn't be allowed to incite violence. But short of that, you ought to be allowed to express ideas with which I disagree, and with which all of my friends disagree, with which I might feel personally offended at. And I want to defend your right to say what you believe. Because once we start telling people, you can't say that, that's not acceptable, and if you say that, there'll be consequences, then we are deep in the realms of the thought police. And if anyone's watching this and you haven't read the letter, please read it, because as Douglas Murray writes, the contents were fairly anodyne. The letter spoke of, quote, the free exchange of information and ideas, and how this constituted, quote, the lifeblood of a liberal society. Cancel culture is bad, my friends. But the dreaming spires of our universities should embrace free speech or not, and 50% of people should go to university or not. What's this article all about?
Yes, so this article followed Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State for Education, essentially scrapping the target for 50% of young people in the UK to go on to higher education at university. So what he challenged was, the quote was, the inbuilt snobbishness about higher being somehow better than further education, that is, when really they are both just different paths to fulfilling and skilled employment. Now, Chris Skidmore wrote what I thought was a very interesting piece, actually, about essentially drawing on his time as a universities minister, and saying that he actually always found this target profoundly unhelpful, and that although it did help drive people up to go to university, which on one hand is good for certain people, and actually it sometimes was at the expense of focus on some real failings. So I think he talked about, for example, young boys in social care, where I think the figures there were truly shocking, like something like 5 or 6% going on to higher education. So actually sometimes this focus on an overall target just meant that perhaps it was, just well-to-do middle-class kids that were going off to university and very little focus on some of the real failings. And what he was saying, that actually ditching this target presents a real opportunity to redefine education and training in the 21st century. Obviously, after COVID, I think what we're going to see is a real acceleration of some trends. So he's saying that the training and indeed retraining for the digital age needs to happen not just for 18-year-olds, but everyone throughout their lives, which on one hand doesn't sound that controversial, but it would be a huge shift in education policy to actually really acknowledge that, why is education and retraining limited to such a narrow kind of age range when actually there is real demand, when I think, especially when you look at even recent history, times when industry in the north of England started to collapse and there was perhaps not the emphasis on retraining these people for the new industries. So we saw old industries collapse, but no real help for people to reskill themselves for the new industries. And I think it would be a great shame if we go through the same cycle now, arguably with what you might call the creative destruction of certain old industries like retail on the high street and the likes, without having this real recalibration of education away from this narrow focus of just getting more young people to university and not actually thinking, well, does someone need retraining at the age of 40 perhaps to actually get them skilled up to start to be able to operate in some of these new digital industries that we're going to see emerging. So I thought it was a really good article, actually, well worth a read.
Alan.
Yeah, I think it's a great article. I think it's something that's been talked about a lot in education circles for a long time, is this idea that actually kind of a university degree seems to become an end of in itself. And rather than focusing just on further education or education being the silver bullet, it became, no, really only one type of education is important, and that's university education. And we've started to see a move away from that. The Met Police, I think, recently said that you don't need a degree now to be a police officer. I think that's a really, really good step. We need to start looking at, well, what is the purpose of a degree? To give you information and to give you information about an area and to signal to employers that you are, have further education in a particular area. But we've gotten into this idea that universities is the only endpoint, that getting into university either makes or breaks you, and that is a terrible signal to lots of families and people who don't go to university, who don't even want to go to university. So I actually think we have to, I think it's really good that we've changed this. I think it's, Gavin Williamson's absolutely right. I think it's going to take a long time to unwind some of these kind of Blair era, either intentional or unintentional targets, but I think they were certainly moving in the right direction.
Well, I hate agreeing with you both, but I'm going to agree with you both and then make an additional point. So I agree that, lifelong learning is here to stay. It shouldn't be this relentless focus on university. We've got a culture which is broadly snobbish about universities. Did you go? Didn't you go? Where did you go? What degree did you get? But I'd also like to champion the role of universities for people from all kinds of backgrounds and who are on all kinds of career trajectories and career aspirations. Because I don't think going to university is necessarily about getting skills. I think it's about learning how to think rather than learning what to think. I think it's about getting critical, analytical, reflective and reflexive skills. It's about mastering a subject and getting a body of knowledge. It's not called reading for a degree for no reason. And when I speak to university lecturer friends of mine, lots of students are less interested in reading and less interested in the discipline of absorbing information in that way. But if we don't have a significant number, and I don't think it should be 50%, I don't know what it should be, of young people that go to university because they want to have sharp minds and they want to amass knowledge in a particular subject, then I think society and our communities will be weaker for it. So I think university ought to be about the mind and about the intellect and about learning for the sake of having knowledge and learning how to think. What do you think?
I agree completely. I think one of the things I 100% agree with that. And I agree with Luke's earlier point about the idea of lifelong learning. What we're seeing now is the career you start in may not be the career you finish in. You might, some research seems to suggest you might flip careers up to 10, 15 times over your lifetime working. So the point of in university, the point of further education is exactly that. You're absolutely right. It's to build life skills. It's to build a love of learning. It's to build an interest in learning. It's to build I don't work in a field that's related to my degree anymore, but I have a lot of the skills that I learned from that time. I think that's going to be our world. And I think the other piece of all of this we're going to have to get to, and Luke talked about it, but we also need, there is sometimes a degree of stigma around going back to university or going back to further education, later in life. We have to get rid of that. We have to get the idea that actually people are going to go retrain and redevelop and learn new skills entirely through their lives. And that has to be embedded. And it can't just be an add-on to work, or it can't be just a nice to have. It's going to have to be a key skill that we all have to get better at. And I think that's, as well as changing the structure, the government's going to have to change people's attitude to it.
Now, if you watch the Conservative Progress Digital Media Review, you'll notice we've been speaking more quickly. We've rattled through our 3 articles with great alacrity. I think I heard one of Alan's children in the background, because we're recording this on Saturday morning. So we're all in, hello! So we're all in trepidation. Sorry, of course, the camera's only on me, so you can't see that I just said hello to a lovely young lady. But I'm going to keep her face off screen. I'm going to thank you very much for watching. I'm going to thank Luke Springthorpe. Great to have you back, mate. Thanks, Alan O'Kelly. And it's a wrap. We'll see you next week, where we've got not one, but 2 guests from 1828. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching our video. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell.